My name is Daniel, and for nearly 5 years I worked the night shift at a small hospital in rural Pennsylvania. Most people imagined hospitals were busy 24 hours a day. The truth was very different after midnight. The hallways became quiet, the waiting rooms emptied, the conversations faded away. Only the hum of machines remained. I usually enjoyed the silence. It made the long hours easier to handle. St. Mercy Hospital was over 100 years old. New buildings had been added over the decades. However, the original structure still stood at the center of the property. Many employees disliked walking through that section at night. They claimed strange things happened there. Some reported hearing voices in empty rooms. Others swore they saw people standing in hallways that disappeared moments later. I never believed any of it. Ghost stories seemed like a normal part of working in an old hospital. At least that was what I thought before that night. The shift started like any other. Rain hammered against the windows as I arrived just before 11 o'clock. The parking lot was almost empty. Dark clouds covered the sky. A cold wind pushed leaves across the pavement. Inside the security office, I reviewed the nightly report. Nothing unusual was listed. A few maintenance requests had been filed. Everything seemed routine. I expected another boring night. Around midnight, I began my first patrol. The emergency department remained active. Nurses moved between rooms, doctors reviewed charts, ambulances occasionally arrived at the entrance. Everything looked normal there. The upper floors were much quieter. Most patients were asleep. The dimmed lights created long shadows along the corridors. The entire building felt heavier than usual. I couldn't explain why. At 1:17 a.m., I returned to the security office to monitor the cameras. I slowly checked each screen. The lobby was empty. The parking garage was empty. The cafeteria was closed. Then I noticed something unusual on a camera covering the old east wing. A woman appeared to be standing at the far end of the hallway. She wasn't moving. She wasn't walking. She was simply standing there. I leaned closer to the monitor. The image quality wasn't great. Even so, I could tell she was wearing what looked like a hospital gown. Her dark hair covered most of her face. Her head was tilted downward. I watched for nearly a minute. She never moved an inch. I called the nurses' station nearby. No patients were reported missing. No staff members were working in that corridor. Suddenly, the situation felt much stranger. I grabbed my flashlight and radio. The east wing was only a few minutes away. As I walked there, the hospital seemed unusually quiet. Even the usual sounds felt distant. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridor. When I reached the location shown on the monitor, nobody was there. The hallway was completely empty. Every door was closed. The woman had vanished. I searched several nearby rooms. Most were used for storage. Others had been abandoned for years. Dust covered the furniture. Old medical equipment sat forgotten in corners. There were no signs that anyone had recently been there. I was about to leave when my radio suddenly crackled. The dispatcher sounded nervous. She asked why I'd entered room E214. My heart immediately skipped a beat. I stared at the closed door of room E214. It was directly across the hallway from me. I had not gone inside. In fact, I hadn't even touched the handle. I told the dispatcher there must be a mistake. She replied that a security camera clearly showed someone wearing my uniform entering the room less than a minute earlier. Her voice sounded completely serious. I looked down at my own uniform. I was standing exactly where I had been the entire time. For the first time that night, I felt genuinely unsettled. Slowly, I walked toward room E214. The air felt colder with every step. I pressed my flashlight against the dusty window in the door. At first, I saw only darkness. Then something moved near the back wall. It was fast, far too fast for me to identify. A chill ran through my body. My hand tightened around the flashlight. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, unaware that this decision would become the biggest mistake of my life. The room smelled like rust, dust, and old disinfectant. My flashlight beam swept slowly across the floor. Broken cabinets lined one wall. A cracked hospital bed sat in the corner beneath a stained sheet. The room appeared abandoned for years, yet something felt wrong. The air was unusually cold. Every breath I took became faintly visible. Then I noticed a fresh set of footprints in the dust. They led toward the back of the room and disappeared at a solid concrete wall. I moved closer to examine the footprints. They looked recent. The dust around them had been disturbed only hours earlier. I followed them carefully until I reached the wall. There was nowhere else to go. No hidden doorway, no open vent, no explanation. As I studied the surface, I heard a faint whisper behind me. It was so quiet that I almost thought it was my imagination. Then I heard it again. Someone softly said, "Don't turn around." Every muscle in my body froze. The voice sounded like a woman. It was weak and distant. I stared at the wall in front of me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The room had become completely silent. Even the hum of electricity seemed gone. For several seconds, I stood perfectly still. Then my radio suddenly burst to life. The loud noise nearly made me jump out of my skin. The dispatcher was calling my name repeatedly. I grabbed the radio immediately. My voice shook as I answered. The dispatcher sounded panicked. She asked why I was standing alone in the room talking to someone. I felt a chill run down my spine. I told her I wasn't speaking to anyone. There was silence on the other end. Then she said the camera showed two people inside room E214. One was me. The other was standing directly behind me. I slowly looked toward the dark reflection in a nearby window. I was completely alone. Without another word, I hurried out of the room. The hallway felt much safer than the darkness inside. I closed the door behind me and locked it. As I turned away, I noticed something strange. The hallway lights had become noticeably dimmer. Shadows stretched across the floor. The far end of the corridor seemed darker than before. Then I saw the woman again. She was standing exactly where she had appeared on the camera earlier. This time, she was much closer. Her hospital gown hung loosely from her thin frame. Long black hair covered most of her face. She stood beneath a flickering fluorescent light. Neither of us moved. I raised my flashlight toward her. The beam illuminated the empty hallway. The woman was gone. I lowered the flashlight. She was standing there again. My stomach tightened with fear. Whatever I was seeing was impossible.
The radio crackled once more. The dispatcher's voice sounded terrified. She told me to leave the East Wing immediately. Before I could ask why, she said every camera in that section had stopped working. One by one, the screens had gone black. The only camera still functioning showed me standing alone in the hallway. However, there was something else visible on the monitor. According to her, dozens of shadowy figures were standing behind me. I turned around instantly. The hallway was empty. I began walking back toward the main hospital building. At first, I walked quickly. Then I heard footsteps behind me. They matched my pace perfectly. When I walked faster, they walked faster. When I slowed down, they slowed down. The sound echoed through the corridor. I spun around several times. Nobody was there. The footsteps continued anyway. They sounded closer with every second. Eventually, they were so near that it felt as though someone was walking directly at my shoulder. A heavy metal door suddenly slammed somewhere behind me. The sound exploded through the hallway. I nearly dropped my flashlight. The lights above me flickered violently. For a moment, the corridor went completely dark. When the lights returned, every door along the hallway stood open. I knew for a fact they had been closed only seconds earlier. The darkness inside each room seemed unnatural. It looked thick and deep, almost alive. Then I heard something that I will never forget. A woman's voice echoed from every open room at once. It was the same voice I had heard inside room E214. Calmly and clearly, it spoke a single sentence. "You shouldn't have come here tonight." The words seemed to vibrate through the walls. Every light in the hallway instantly went out. Darkness swallowed everything around me, and somewhere ahead I heard dozens of footsteps running toward me. For a moment, I stood frozen in absolute darkness, gripping my flashlight so tightly that my knuckles ached, while the sound of dozens of footsteps thundered through the corridor toward me from somewhere beyond the reach of my vision, growing louder with each passing second until it seemed impossible that so many people could be moving through a wing of the hospital that had supposedly been abandoned for years. My breathing became rapid and shallow as I desperately pressed the flashlight's power button, silently praying that the batteries had not failed at the worst possible moment. And when the beam finally flickered back to life, the corridor ahead appeared completely empty, despite the unmistakable sound of movement echoing from every direction around me. The light shook violently in my trembling hand as I swept it from one side of the hallway to the other, searching for any explanation that might make sense of what I was hearing. Yet every doorway remained empty and every room appeared deserted. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise. It felt unnatural, as though the entire building had paused to listen. Even the air seemed heavier than before. I could feel a pressure building inside my chest that had nothing to do with fear alone. Every instinct told me to run. Every survival instinct screamed that I should leave the East Wing immediately and never return. Yet a strange curiosity kept me rooted in place. Deep down, I felt that whatever was happening had only just begun. As I continued moving cautiously toward the main corridor connecting the old wing to the newer parts of the hospital, I noticed something that immediately made my blood run cold, because the walls surrounding me no longer looked exactly the way they had only minutes earlier. And subtle details seemed to have changed in ways that were impossible to explain. The paint appeared newer. The floor tiles looked cleaner. Old storage rooms that had been locked and abandoned suddenly displayed department signs that should not have existed anymore. A nurse's station that had been empty when I arrived now appeared fully furnished. Medical charts sat neatly stacked on the counter. A desk lamp glued softly beside a telephone. For a few terrifying seconds, I genuinely wondered whether I had somehow become lost.
But that explanation made no sense. I knew this wing better than almost anyone working at the hospital. Something far stranger was happening. The realization struck me when I noticed a calendar hanging on the wall beside the nurse's station, because instead of displaying the current year, it showed a date from more than 30 years earlier. And although my rational mind immediately searched for a logical explanation, I could not ignore the feeling that the environment around me was somehow transforming into something from the past. My flashlight beam moved slowly across faded photographs mounted on the wall. The faces in the pictures belonged to doctors and nurses I had never seen before. Their uniforms looked outdated. Their hairstyles belonged to another era. One photograph caught my attention more than the others. It showed a young nurse smiling beside a patient room. Beneath the image was a small nameplate. The name printed there matched the name of the woman whose disappearance had become the subject of countless rumors among longtime hospital employees. I felt my stomach tighten the moment I recognized it.
Years earlier, I'd heard fragments of a story involving a nurse who vanished during a night shift without leaving behind any explanation, and according to older staff members, extensive searches had failed to uncover what happened to her, leading many people to speculate that she had simply abandoned her job and started a new life elsewhere. However, standing there in that hallway while staring at her photograph, I suddenly remembered another detail that most people considered nothing more than an urban legend. Some employees claimed that strange events always seemed to increase around the anniversary of her disappearance. Others claimed they had seen a woman matching her description walking through the East Wing late at night. Most dismissed those stories as nonsense. I certainly had. Yet now I found myself staring at her face while surrounded by circumstances that defied every reasonable explanation I could think of. The coincidence felt impossible. Before I could process any of it further, a loud metallic crash echoed from somewhere deeper within the wing, causing me to spin around immediately as the sound reverberated through the hallways and disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. My heart began racing again. The noise had sounded close, much too close. For several seconds I listened carefully. Then I heard something else. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a cry for help. It sounded more like distant laughter. The sound was faint, yet there was something deeply unsettling about it. It carried a strange sadness beneath it, as though whoever was laughing had long since forgotten how to feel anything else. The sound drifted through the corridor before vanishing completely, leaving me alone once again with the growing feeling that I was no longer experiencing reality as I understood it. Determined to find an exit and contact someone outside the East Wing, I continued forward until I reached an intersection where several hallways branched in different directions, only to discover that the passage leading back toward the modern section of the hospital no longer existed in the way it should have. Instead of connecting to the familiar corridor I used every night, the hallway extended into darkness far beyond its normal length. The architecture was wrong. The dimensions were wrong. Even the lighting looked different. I stopped walking and stared ahead in disbelief. It felt as though the hospital itself had changed shape around me. Every logical explanation collapsed under the weight of what I was seeing. I knew where I should have been, yet the hospital no longer matched the place I had entered earlier that night. And for the first time, a terrifying possibility entered my mind. Maybe I wasn't lost inside the hospital anymore. Maybe the hospital itself was lost. The longer I stood at that impossible intersection, the more convinced I became that something was manipulating the environment around me, because every instinct I possessed told me that the hallway ahead should have ended after a few dozen feet.
yet the beam from my flashlight disappeared into darkness without revealing a wall, a doorway, or any indication of where the corridor actually stopped. The silence pressed against my ears with such intensity that I could hear the faint rhythm of my own heartbeat echoing through my skull. I considered turning back, but the thought of returning to the rooms behind me felt even worse. The shadows seemed deeper there, more watchful, as if they had been patiently waiting for me to make a mistake. Every second I remained still increased the sensation that unseen eyes were studying my movements. Eventually, I realized that standing in one place was accomplishing nothing. With no better option available, I forced myself to continue forward into the darkness. As I walked, the atmosphere around me changed in subtle ways that became impossible to ignore, because the smell of dust and disinfectant gradually gave way to something older and far more disturbing, a mixture of damp concrete, stale air, and decay that reminded me of buildings abandoned for decades. The temperature continued dropping until each breath felt painfully cold in my lungs. Frost began forming along the edges of nearby windows, despite the fact that it wasn't nearly cold enough outside for ice to appear. The hospital no longer felt like a functioning medical facility. It felt like a forgotten place, hidden beneath reality itself. My flashlight illuminated old wheelchairs, rusted equipment, and stacks of cardboard records that appeared untouched for years. None of these items should have been there. I knew that because I had patrolled this wing hundreds of times before. Yet somehow the corridor kept revealing objects and rooms I had never seen. It was as though an entirely different version of the hospital existed beneath the one everyone else knew. Several minutes later, I noticed a faint glow emanating from beneath a partially open door at the end of the hallway, and although every rational part of my mind warned me to avoid it, I found myself moving toward the light because it represented the first sign of human activity I had encountered since everything began changing around me. The closer I got, the more clearly I could hear sounds coming from inside the room. At first, they resembled distant conversations. Then I realized they were conversations. Multiple voices, men and women speaking in low tones. The sound was unmistakable. Relief washed over me. For a brief moment, I believed I had found hospital staff working late in a section I didn't know about. I hurried forward and reached for the door. The sudden silence felt deliberate, as though everyone inside had become aware of my presence at exactly the same moment, and that realization sent a wave of unease through me before I slowly pushed the door open and directed my flashlight into the room beyond. What I saw made my entire body go rigid. The room was not empty. Dozens of people occupied it. Patients sat on beds arranged in neat rows. Nurses stood beside them. Doctors moved between the aisles. Every single person in the room appeared completely motionless. No one blinked, no one breathed, no one spoke. They simply stared in my direction. Their expressions on their faces were blank and unnatural. Their eyes reflected the flashlight beam with a strange glassy appearance that made them look less like living people and more like figures trapped inside a photograph. For several seconds, nobody moved, and I found myself unable to look away from the impossible scene unfolding before me, because the room appeared frozen in time, as though I had somehow stepped into a moment that had existed decades earlier and remained preserved long after everyone involved should have disappeared. Then one of the nurses slowly turned her head toward me. The movement was unnatural, jerky, delayed, like an old videotape playing at the wrong speed. A patient near the back of the room followed, then another, then another. Within moments, every person inside the room was looking directly at me. A deep feeling of dread settled into my chest. I understood with terrifying certainty that I was not supposed to be there. Without warning, all of the lights in the room exploded simultaneously, plunging the entire area into darkness, while the sound of shattering glass echoed through the corridor like gunfire, causing me to stumble backward and nearly lose my balance as panic surged through my body. The voices returned instantly. This time they weren't whispering, they were screaming. Dozens of voices, hundreds perhaps, men, women, children, all speaking over one another in a chaotic storm of sound that made it impossible to understand a single word. The noise filled every corner of the hallway. It felt as though the building itself had come alive. I slammed the door shut and ran. My footsteps pounded against the floor as I sprinted through the corridor, desperately trying to put distance between myself and whatever existed inside that room. Yet the screaming followed me no matter how far I ran, growing louder each time I glanced over my shoulder, as though the source of the sound was rapidly gaining ground behind me. The flashlight beam bounced wildly across walls and doorways. My breathing became ragged. Fear had completely replaced logic. I no longer cared about finding answers. I only wanted to escape. The hallway seemed endless. Every turn revealed another stretch of darkness. Every intersection led to unfamiliar corridors. It felt like a nightmare that refused to end. Then, ahead of me, I saw a figure standing perfectly still beneath a flickering ceiling light. The woman from the camera had returned, but this time she was close enough for me to see details that had previously been hidden beneath the shadows, and the moment my flashlight illuminated her face, a cold wave of horror swept through me, because she wasn't a stranger at all. She was the nurse from the photograph, the same woman who had vanished decades earlier. Her skin appeared pale and lifeless. Dark circles surrounded her eyes. Yet there was something deeply human in her expression. She didn't look angry. She didn't look threatening. She looked frightened, more frightened than I was. Slowly, she raised one trembling hand and pointed toward a narrow hallway branching off to the right. Then she whispered a single sentence. "They're waking up." The words barely left her lips before a deep vibration rolled through the floor beneath my feet, causing nearby walls to tremble as distant metallic impacts echoed somewhere far below the hospital. And for the first time since entering the East Wing, I realized that whatever had been manipulating the building around me was not the woman. She wasn't the source of the nightmare. She was trapped inside it. The true danger was something else entirely. Something larger, older, something that had remained hidden beneath the hospital for decades. As the vibration intensified and the lights overhead began flickering violently, I heard a new sound rising from the darkness behind me. It wasn't footsteps, it wasn't voices, it sounded like something massive beginning to move. The sound continued growing louder until it no longer resembled anything I could compare to an ordinary noise, because it carried a strange combination of scraping metal, shifting concrete, and a deep vibration that seemed to resonate through the very bones of the building itself, creating the terrifying impression that something enormous was moving somewhere beneath the hospital. I stood frozen for a brief moment, staring at the woman who had once been a nurse, hoping she might offer some explanation for what was happening. Her pale face tightened with fear. She glanced repeatedly toward the darkness behind me. The expression in her eyes was not the expression of a ghost trying to frighten someone. It was the expression of someone desperately trying to warn them. Before I could ask a single question, she took a step backwards, then another, Moments later, she disappeared into the shadows as though she had never been there at all. The corridor immediately became colder after she vanished, and a thick silence settled over the area, despite the distant vibrations continuing beneath the floor, creating an atmosphere so oppressive that every breath felt heavier than the last. My flashlight flickered again. This time it remained dim for several seconds before stabilizing. The weakening beam revealed something unusual on the floor near where the nurse had been standing. There was a trail of muddy footprints leading into the narrow hallway she had pointed toward. Unlike the mysterious footprints I had seen earlier, these appeared fresh. The moisture on the floor glistened beneath the light. I crouched down to examine them more closely. The mud was dark and carried a strong, earthy smell. It looked as though someone had recently climbed out of a place buried deep underground. Realizing I had no better option, I followed the trail into the narrow passage, moving cautiously while keeping my flashlight aimed ahead, because every instinct warned me that whatever waited at the end of that hallway would bring me closer to the truth behind the nightmare unfolding around me. The passage was much smaller than the main corridors. Exposed pipes lined the ceiling. Water dripped steadily from somewhere above. The further I walked, the older the construction appeared. Modern medical materials gradually gave way to rough concrete and aging brick. It felt less like a medical facility and more like a forgotten tunnel hidden beneath it. The muddy footprints continued forward without interruption. Whoever had made them had been moving quickly. As I rounded a corner, I noticed an old metal door standing partially open at the end of the passage. The door appeared ancient, far older than anything else I'd encountered that night, and faded warning signs attached to its surface suggested that it had once restricted access to an area no longer shown on any modern hospital blueprint. Rust covered most of the metal. The hinges looked ready to collapse. Yet despite its age, the door had clearly been opened recently. Fresh scratches marked the floor beneath it. A cold draft emerged from the darkness beyond. I approached slowly. Every step felt heavier than the last. My flashlight illuminated faded lettering painted on the wall nearby. Although much of it had deteriorated over time, one phrase remained legible: Sub-level C. I had never heard of a sub-level C. The moment I stepped through the doorway, I realized I had entered a section of the hospital that should not have existed, because the area beyond resembled an underground facility abandoned decades earlier, complete with long concrete corridors, rusting equipment, and rows of sealed rooms extending into darkness on either side. Dust coated nearly every surface. Thick cobwebs hung from exposed pipes overhead. Yet despite the obvious signs of age, there were indications that something still occupied the area. Several doors stood open. Fresh footprints crossed the floor. A distant light flickered somewhere ahead. The deeper I looked into the corridor, the more uncomfortable I became. It felt as though I had crossed an invisible boundary separating the known world from something hidden beneath it, something deliberately forgotten. As I continued exploring, I discovered old documents scattered across a collapsed desk near what appeared to have once been a security station, and although many pages had become unreadable with age, a handful remained intact enough to reveal fragments of information that immediately captured my attention. The documents referenced unusual incidents occurring throughout the hospital during the late 1980s. Patients reported hearing voices from empty rooms. Staff members described missing time. Several employees claimed to have encountered people who no longer existed. Most disturbing of all were references to unexplained disappearances. Names had been listed. Dates had been recorded. Entire investigations had been conducted, yet many pages ended abruptly. Some reports appeared intentionally censored. Others looked as though someone had attempted to destroy them. One file in particular stood out among the rest because it contained a photograph I immediately recognized, showing the same nurse whose spirit I had encountered earlier that night, standing beside a group of doctors in front of a heavy steel door located somewhere within the underground facility. Unlike the previous photograph upstairs, this one included handwritten notes on the back. My flashlight trembled slightly as I read them. The note referenced a containment project. It mentioned recurring manifestations. It described unexplained activity beneath the hospital foundations. Most importantly, it stated that a sealed chamber had been discovered during construction decades earlier. According to the note, nobody knew who built it. Nobody knew how old it was. Yet every unusual event seemed connected to whatever existed inside. A sudden metallic bang echoed through the underground corridor before I could finish reading, causing me to look up sharply as the sound reverberated through the tunnels and disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. Seconds later, another impact followed, then another. The noises seemed deliberate, rhythmic, almost like something striking metal from the opposite side of a wall. My pulse quickened. The impacts continued. Each one sounded stronger than the last. Dust drifted from the ceiling with every strike. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed shut. The air suddenly felt charged with tension. Whatever had been dormant beneath the hospital no longer seemed content to remain hidden. Then I heard voices again, except this time they were clearer than before, emerging from somewhere ahead in the darkness as faint whispers that gradually merged into recognizable words, and although I could not identify every sentence, one phrase repeated over and over with disturbing consistency: "Do not open it." The voices belonged to different people, men, women, young, old. Some sounded frightened, others sounded desperate, yet all repeated the same warning: "Do not open it." The words echoed through the underground corridors from multiple directions at once. It was impossible to determine where they originated. The warning felt less like a message and more like a plea from countless people who had learned something terrible. As I stood there listening to the whispers, another sound emerged from somewhere deeper within the underground facility, a slow grinding noise followed by the unmistakable screech of heavy metal moving against metal, and in that instant I realized with absolute certainty that something had just been opened. The whispers stopped immediately. Every voice vanished. The silence that followed felt catastrophic. Then, from far within the darkness ahead, I saw a faint glow appear where no light should have existed. It wasn't the white glow of fluorescent bulbs. It wasn't the yellow glow of emergency lighting. It was a pale, unnatural light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. And as the glow slowly grew brighter, I became aware of a horrifying fact. Something was coming toward me from inside the sealed chamber. For several long seconds, I remained completely motionless while staring at the pale light advancing through the darkness, because every instinct inside me screamed that whatever was approaching was unlike anything I had ever encountered before, and the unnatural glow seemed to distort the corridor around it, as though reality itself struggled to contain whatever existed within its center. The light pulsed slowly. Each pulse illuminated the walls. Then the darkness swallowed them again. The rhythm reminded me of a heartbeat, a massive heartbeat, one that did not belong to any living creature I could imagine. The air temperature continued dropping. Frost spread across nearby pipes. Tiny crystals formed along the floor. The closer the light came, the colder everything became.
I forced myself to back away slowly while keeping my flashlight pointed toward the approaching glow, yet the beam seemed strangely ineffective because instead of illuminating the source, it appeared to dissolve into the pale light as though swallowed by a thick fog invisible to the naked eye. My breathing echoed loudly through the corridor. Every small sound felt amplified. The underground facility had become unnaturally quiet. No machinery hummed, no water dripped from the pipes, even the building itself seemed to be holding its breath. Then I noticed movement inside the glow, a silhouette, human in shape, at least at first glance. It moved with an awkward, unnatural gait that made my stomach tighten. Something about its proportions felt wrong. As the figure emerged further into view, I realized I was looking at a person wearing what appeared to be an old hospital gown. But the longer I stared, the more impossible the figure became, because its limbs seemed slightly too long, and its movements appeared delayed, as though different parts of its body were operating independently from one another. Its head hung at an unnatural angle, its arms swayed loosely, yet it continued walking forward without hesitation. The pale light surrounded it completely, shadows twisted around its feet. For a moment I wondered whether I was looking at another trapped spirit like the nurse upstairs. Then the figure lifted its head. The face had no eyes, only darkness. A wave of terror hit me so hard that my body reacted before my mind could process what I was seeing, causing me to turn and run deeper into the underground complex, while the sound of my footsteps exploded through the corridor behind me. The cold air burned my lungs. My flashlight beam bounced wildly across walls and ceilings. Every hallway looked identical. Every turn revealed more darkness. Yet beneath the panic, I could hear something even worse. The figure was still following me. It wasn't running, it wasn't rushing, it moved at the same slow pace as before, yet somehow the distance between us continued shrinking. No matter how fast I moved, it remained close behind. The realization was almost more terrifying than the creature itself. After several frantic minutes, I burst into a large underground chamber that appeared to have once served as some kind of research area, and the moment my flashlight illuminated the room, I realized I had stumbled upon the very place where the hospital's darkest secret had been hidden for decades. Old desks filled the chamber, filing cabinets lined the walls, broken computers sat beneath thick layers of dust. Large observation windows overlooked another room beyond. Most of the glass had shattered years ago. Documents covered the floor. Some had yellowed with age, others appeared surprisingly recent. The entire room looked as though everyone had abandoned it in a hurry, as if something had happened here that nobody wanted to remember.
I hurried toward the nearest desk and began searching through the scattered files while keeping one eye on the corridor behind me, knowing I had very little time before whatever was pursuing me arrived. Many documents were damaged beyond recognition. Others contained technical information I couldn't understand. Then I found a thick folder marked Restricted Access. Inside were hundreds of pages detailing a series of experiments conducted beneath the hospital, beginning nearly 40 years earlier. The records described unusual phenomena discovered during an excavation project beneath the original foundation. Workers had uncovered a sealed stone structure buried far below ground. The structure did not match any known architectural style. Carbon dating produced impossible results. According to several reports, the chamber appeared significantly older than the surrounding region itself. The deeper I read, the more horrifying the information became, because researchers assigned to investigate the discovery had almost immediately documented strange effects after entering the buried structure, including auditory hallucinations, missing time, recurring nightmares, and encounters with figures that did not appear to exist physically, yet somehow left evidence of their presence behind. Staff members reported hearing voices coming from empty rooms. Security cameras captured individuals who could not be identified. Patients began describing the same recurring dream despite having no connection to one another. Some researchers believed the chamber was affecting human perception. Others believed something inside the chamber was actively communicating with people. None of the reports reached a definitive conclusion. Several investigators disappeared before their studies could be completed. One particular report contained the name of the missing nurse, and as I read through the final pages of her file, I learned that she had not vanished by accident, as most employees believed, but had actually volunteered to participate in an emergency containment procedure after a catastrophic incident occurred within the underground facility. According to the report, researchers had accidentally breached an inner section of the buried structure during excavation. Shortly afterward, manifestations began appearing throughout the hospital. Patients reported seeing impossible figures. Staff members experienced violent hallucinations. Entire sections of the building seemed to change shape without explanation. The nurse had been among the first to recognize a pattern. She believed the manifestations were attempting to lure people toward the buried chamber beneath the hospital. The final entry ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence. After that, there was nothing. A loud scraping sound suddenly echoed from outside the research room, instantly pulling my attention away from the documents, as the realization struck me that the eyeless figure had finally reached the chamber. The sound moved slowly along the corridor, closer, closer. Then it stopped. Silence filled the room. I held my breath. The flashlight trembled in my hand. Seconds passed, then a shadow appeared in the doorway. The figure stood motionless, watching, waiting. The pale glow surrounding it illuminated the corridor behind. Yet despite its terrifying appearance, it still made no attempt to attack. Instead, the creature slowly raised one arm and pointed toward the observation windows overlooking the room beyond, a gesture so deliberate and unexpected that for a moment I forgot my fear and found myself turning to follow its direction. Beyond the shattered glass stood a massive circular chamber unlike anything else beneath the hospital. Ancient stone walls surrounded the space. Strange symbols covered the surface. Metal scaffolding erected decades earlier had partially collapsed into the center. At the very heart of the chamber stood a colossal stone doorway embedded in the earth itself. It was far larger than any human construction should have been. The pale glow seemed to originate from beyond it. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The doorway was open. As I stared into the ancient chamber, a deep vibration rolled through the underground facility once more, stronger than anything I had felt earlier, causing the floor beneath my feet to tremble violently, while dust rained from the ceiling above. And somewhere beyond the open stone doorway, hidden within the pale light, I heard the unmistakable sound of something enormous taking a single step. The noise echoed through the chamber like distant thunder. Another step followed, then another. Whatever existed beyond that doorway was moving closer, much closer. Suddenly, every missing person, every ghostly manifestation, every impossible event connected to the hospital made terrifying sense. The spirits weren't haunting the building. They were trapped there. Trapped because they had spent decades trying to keep something far worse from reaching the world above.
The realization hit me with overwhelming force as I stood frozen before the shattered observation window, because for the first time that night, every impossible event began fitting together into a horrifying picture that made far more sense than I wanted it to.
The apparitions wandering the hospital were not the threat. The whispers had not been warnings from something evil trying to deceive me. The missing nurse had not been attempting to lure me into danger. They had all been trying to prevent the same thing. Every strange encounter, every unexplained sighting, every voice repeating the same desperate message, they were all connected to the enormous stone doorway standing open in the center of the chamber below. Something had escaped, or perhaps something was in the process of escaping. Either possibility was terrifying. Another tremendous impact shook the underground facility, causing cracks to spread across sections of the ceiling, while chunks of concrete crashed onto the floor below. And as dust filled the air, I noticed movement throughout the chamber unlike anything I had witnessed before. Figures were appearing everywhere, dozens of them, then hundreds. Pale forms emerged from corridors, observation rooms, and dark corners hidden throughout the facility. Some wore hospital gowns, others wore medical uniforms. A few appeared to be construction workers. Many looked partially transparent. Yet despite their differences, every one of them moved toward the open doorway. None attempted to flee. None appeared interested in me. Their attention remained fixed entirely upon the massive opening radiating pale light. It was as though they had been waiting for this moment. As the spirits gathered around the ancient structure, the air within the chamber began vibrating with a low hum that grew steadily louder until it resembled the sound of a distant engine, and the collective presence of so many apparitions created an unsettling glow that illuminated the underground complex in shifting waves of pale silver light. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying. Some spirits stood shoulder to shoulder, others knelt. A few stretched their hands toward the doorway. Their faces reflected determination rather than fear. Watching them, I realized something extraordinary. They were not prisoners, at least not entirely. They had remained behind by choice. Decades after death, they were still standing guard over whatever existed beyond that threshold. The weight of that sacrifice settled heavily upon me. Then the pale light pouring from the doorway suddenly intensified, flooding the chamber with such brightness that I was forced to shield my eyes, and a deep sound emerged from beyond the opening that resembled neither a voice nor a roar, but carried elements of both. The sound seemed to vibrate directly inside my mind. Every instinct screamed that it did not belong in our world. The spirits reacted immediately. The entire chamber filled with movement. Hundreds of figures stepped forward simultaneously. The hum surrounding them grew louder. Symbols carved into the stone walls began glowing faintly. The air crackled with energy. Something was happening, something that likely occurred many times before, a battle invisible to the living world. As my eyes adjusted to the brightness, I finally saw a shape moving within the doorway itself, and the sheer scale of what emerged shattered every remaining assumption I had about reality, because the figure was far too large to pass through the opening comfortably, forcing portions of its massive body to remain hidden beyond the threshold, while only fragments became visible. Long limbs extended into view, blacker than darkness itself. They seemed less like flesh and more like shadows given physical form. The creature's outline constantly shifted. One moment it appeared vaguely human. The next it resembled something entirely different. My mind struggled to process its shape. Looking directly at it felt wrong, painful, like staring at something human beings were never meant to understand.
The spirits surged forward as one, and a blinding wave of pale light erupted from their collective forms, colliding with the darkness surrounding the creature in a violent explosion that shook the entire underground facility and sent shock waves racing through the chamber. The impact threw me backward against a wall. My flashlight flew from my hand.
Every observation window shattered instantly. The noise was deafening. For several seconds, I could see nothing except white light and darkness twisting together in impossible patterns. The collision felt less like a physical struggle and more like two realities attempting to occupy the same space. The symbols covering the chamber walls glowed brighter, the stone floor cracked, the ancient doorway trembled violently. Amid the chaos, I noticed a familiar figure standing closer to the doorway than any of the others, and through the swirling light I recognized the missing nurse whose spirit had guided me throughout the night. Unlike the surrounding apparitions, she remained perfectly visible. Her expression was calm, determined. She turned toward me briefly. For the first time, I could see her face clearly. There was sadness in her eyes, but there was also hope. Slowly, she pointed toward a control panel mounted on a nearby wall that had somehow survived decades of decay. Several cables connected the panel directly to machinery surrounding the doorway. Understanding dawned instantly. The containment system still existed. It simply needed someone alive to activate it. The realization filled me with equal parts dread and determination, because reaching the control panel required crossing a chamber that was literally collapsing around me, while an ancient entity fought against hundreds of spirits only yards away. Yet I understood that if I failed, everything those people had sacrificed would be meaningless. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to my feet and began running. Debris crashed from above, cracks spread across the floor, waves of energy pulsed through the chamber. Several times I nearly lost my balance. The creature's presence felt overwhelming. Every step toward the control panel felt like moving against hurricane-force winds. Yet somehow I kept going. The spirits continued holding the darkness back long enough for me to reach my destination. When I finally arrived at the panel, I discovered a series of switches accompanied by faded instructions written decades earlier by someone who had clearly anticipated this exact scenario. And although portions of the text had become unreadable with age, one sentence remained perfectly visible. "Seal the doorway before the final breach." My hands shook violently. Warning lights flashed across the panel. Most of the system appeared dead, yet one switch still glowed faintly beneath layers of dust. I stared at it for only a second before slamming it downward with all the force I could muster. Nothing happened. Then the entire facility began shaking harder than ever before. Deep beneath the chamber, ancient machinery suddenly roared to life for the first time in decades, causing massive gears hidden within the stone structure to grind and turn, while sections of the doorway began moving slowly inward. The creature reacted immediately. The darkness surrounding it expanded outward in a furious wave. Several spirits vanished instantly upon contact. Others stepped forward to replace them. The missing nurse remained at the front of the line. The doorway continued closing inch by inch. The process was painfully slow, far too slow. The creature pushed forward. The chamber trembled violently. For one horrifying moment, it looked as though the entity might break through before the seal could complete. Then the nurse looked directly at me one final time, smiled faintly, and stepped into the path of the advancing darkness alongside hundreds of other spirits, creating a barrier of light so intense that the entire underground facility seemed to ignite around them. The creature recoiled. The doorway closed further. The light grew brighter. The darkness fought desperately against it. Cracks spread across the stone structure. The chamber shook with unimaginable force.
and as the final gap narrowed to only a few feet, the spirits unleashed one last brilliant surge of energy that drove the entity backward into the pale glow beyond the threshold, allowing the ancient doorway to slam shut with a thunderous impact that echoed through the earth like the sound of a mountain breaking apart.
The moment the ancient doorway slammed shut, a shock wave ripped through the underground chamber with such force that I was thrown backward across the floor and everything around me disappeared into darkness. The roar of collapsing stone echoed through the facility, metal twisted, concrete cracked. Then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Silence settled over the underground complex. Complete silence. I lay motionless for several moments, struggling to breathe and unsure whether I was alive or dead. When I finally opened my eyes, the pale glow was gone. The doorway had vanished behind layers of collapsed stone. The chamber was dark and still. I don't remember exactly how I found my way back to the surface. Parts of the journey remain a blur even now. Eventually, rescue teams found me unconscious near the entrance to the old East Wing shortly before sunrise. The official report claimed that a structural failure beneath the hospital had caused a series of localized collapses. Investigators spent months examining the damaged areas. Entire sections of the underground facility were sealed permanently. Most of what I saw that night was never mentioned in any report. In fact, many people acted as though those areas had never existed at all. Whenever I tried to explain what happened, I was met with polite silence or skeptical looks. Eventually, I stopped trying. Several weeks later, while recovering at home, I returned to the hospital one final time to collect a few personal belongings from my security office. Most employees assumed I would eventually return to work. I knew I never would. As I walked through the lobby, everything appeared normal. Doctors rushed between departments. Visitors filled the waiting areas. Nurses pushed carts through brightly lit hallways. The hospital looked exactly as it always had, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something invisible, something important. The building felt lighter somehow, as though a burden it had carried for decades had finally been lifted. Before leaving, I found myself standing in front of a display case containing photographs from the hospital's history. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. Then I saw her, the nurse. Her photograph remained exactly where it had always been. This time, however, someone had added a small plaque beneath the frame. It honored employees who had dedicated their lives to helping others. I stared at her picture for a long time. The same calm smile looked back at me. For the first time since that terrible night, I felt a sense of peace. Whatever had happened beneath the hospital, I knew she had finally completed the duties she had carried for so many years. As I turned to leave, something caught my attention in the reflection of the display glass. For a brief moment, I saw several figures standing behind me. Doctors, nurses, patients, dozens of them. They weren't frightening, they weren't threatening. They simply stood there, quietly, watching. Then, one by one, they faded away. The last figure to disappear was the nurse. Before she vanished, she smiled. A second later, the reflection showed only the empty hallway behind me. That was 5 years ago. I have never returned to St. Mercy Hospital. I moved to another state. I found a different career. I built a different life. Yet there are still nights when I wake suddenly at exactly 3:17 a.m. The room is always silent, the house is always dark, and for a few seconds I remember every detail of what happened beneath that hospital. The doorway, the spirits, the impossible darkness waiting beyond the threshold. Most of the time, the memory fades and I eventually fall back asleep. But sometimes, just before drifting off, I hear something, a distant metallic sound, a slow grinding noise, as though enormous stone doors are moving somewhere far underground. Maybe it's only a dream, maybe it's trauma, or maybe somewhere beneath the earth, hidden far below the foundations of forgotten places, there are doors that were never meant to be opened. And maybe the only reason our world remains safe is because someone is still standing guard on the other side. So if you ever find yourself alone in an old hospital late at night, and you happen to see a figure standing silently at the end of a dark hallway, don't follow it. Don't call out to it. And whatever you do, if you hear a voice whispering, don't open it. Listen.